This talk's sort of based loosely around something that I went down to talk to a group about last year, because we appear to be a bit short of meeting subjects recently. So I thought, well, I'm obviously talking in the past about like software like Cashbook and Locate and so on through PDF. The other part of what I talked to Birmingham was about last year might have been of interest, so I thought I'd come along and try and fill an evening with that. There's not really a definite plan here, so if anyone's got any questions or anything's not clear as I go through, please say something as we go, because it may well provide a bit of a diversion anyway, which could well be interesting. But something that I realised about when the new machines started coming out, such as the BeagleBoards and the Raspberry Pis and all the new hardware that RISC-OS now runs on, was that probably for the last 10 years or so I've basically been developing Cashbook through PDF, Locate, and everything I'd written prior to that, from when I started using RISC-OS back in the early 90s, was basically sitting on my website, not being touched because I couldn't develop it, I couldn't work on it for a variety of reasons. And I decided we needed to do something about that and be able to update the software so it would run on the modern hardware. And part of this evening is really just looking at what I did to get that to happen. When I started writing software, I had an A3000, or the family had an A3000 back in the early 90s. And everything I did was written in BASIC. Initially it was just simple tasking applications. I eventually got a book on writing desktop software, which was the one Debug wrote, published I think, and started writing a few very simple web applications. We then upgraded to a RISC PC. I carried on writing software for that. And then, while I was away at university, I actually shared a flat for a couple of years with somebody who had known the bloke behind, if anyone remembers, this could be one of Peter's quiz questions almost, Zob Software. Zob, XOB, I think they were. They were based up in Dundee somewhere, I think, and they did networking software, which, as I understand it, was basically a teacher selling software that a couple of the students were writing. So how that worked in terms of royalties and copyright and legalities, I have no idea. But this bloke convinced me it was probably a good idea to actually release some of the stuff I'd written, which I just had sat on my hard disk at the time, which I ideally did with a bit of a rush and didn't really think about licenses and anything. And it sort of sat there, and when the Ionix came out, I upgraded to Ionix. I upgraded everything to be 32-bit and made that available. But there were a couple of problems that came to light. The first was that all the basic stuff was written in BASIC, so it should run fine on 32-bit machines. But it all depended on a bit of software called Bass Compress, which was written by a guy called Sidebooker, I think. And by the time the Ionix came out, he'd left the platform. The source code for Bass Compress was on a dead hard disk in his loft, I think, he admitted, or something like that. So there was no way it was ever going to leave 26-bit platforms. So I was basically stuck developing all my software on the RISC PC and then testing it on the Ionix, which wasn't really ideal. All the little modules and stuff I'd written in assembly language were all written in the basic assembler using a couple of extensions. There was one by Doggysoft, which I think was BAX, I think, Basic Extended Assembler, and Darren Salt released one, Extended Basic Assembler, something like that. But they were basically add-ons which depended on the versions of BASIC that were in some slightly elderly RISC PCs. They didn't even make it onto RISC-OS 4, so I still had to load older versions of BASIC code to develop them, and they definitely didn't make it to the Ionix. So I was now in the happy situation, I had a new machine, and I was happily developing software now in C on the Ionix using GCC. And if I wanted to develop any old software, I had to power this PC up and work on that, which was fine. It worked all right for a bit until the hard disk crashed. And at that point I discovered my backups weren't quite as good as I thought they were, and I lost most of the source code as well. So that was kind of where things sort of ended up. And I just ignored the problem for a bit. I had versions of, if anyone, I'll come to all the software over the course of the next hour or so. I'd actually been working on a new version of my health application, Fryatt, at the time, and I had no source code for it, but I had a compressed version sitting on the Ionics, and I had slightly updated versions of a few other things, again in compressed form on the Ionics, but that was it. And so I didn't do anything about it, any of the software, for probably the next 5 or 6 years. And then people started moaning at me about the fact that it wouldn't run on modern hardware like bigger boards with Raspberry Pis. So I started to think about it, or what I could do about it. And probably the solution to the problem, or the first solution to the first problem, actually came via a bit of software that wasn't mine at all, but which I'd sort of inherited when I upgraded to the Ionics and sort of 32-bitted it unofficially. And that bit of software was something called Icon Clipboard, which I'm always surprised how few people actually know about it, because it's a very useful bit of software, especially now that so many people are using 32-bit versions of RISC-OS that don't have support for cut and paste and writable icons on the desktop. It's something you take for granted if you use RISC-OS Limited, RISC-OS 4 or RISC-OS 6. But if you then upgrade to RISC-OS 5, you simply find that if you go to a writable icon, it says there isn't one. If you go and find yourself a writable icon somewhere, and try and do Control-C to copy the text out of it, nothing much happens. And I'd obviously had this problem when I'd upgraded from the RISC PC to the Ionics, because I'd been quite happy with Select at that point, and suddenly found that this new RISC-OS 5 had no support for this. And I came across, and a few people I think were discussing on the Ionics mailing list at the time, this module by Thomas Leonard called Icon Clipboard, which wasn't 32-bit, so I went and found a copy, and I decided I would probably make it 32-bit for my own use, which seemed like a good idea. And so I went to Thomas's website and downloaded an archive. I don't still have the original one anywhere, but I'm just trying to find things on this machine. It would have been something like that, just a module, nothing else. There was no source code in the archive, there was nothing. So for my own use, I went off and found a bit of software called Harmonizer, which was written by Dave Ruck. And I'm just going to very briefly actually show this in case it sparks anyone's interest going forward, because it's still very relevant even on modern machines. But Dave Ruck wrote it originally when the Ionics came out to help people actually upgrade software to be 32-bit compatible, particularly stuff that was effectively abandoned and was no longer available. And it's really a sort of developer's tool that plugs in quite nicely into the desktop development environment, but it works standalone as I'm doing here. And if you drop any executable file onto it, it gives you the option of exporting various information about it in various formats, and both text output, and because I want to actually be able to do something with this, ask it for assembly as well. Basically, the output options of verbose will give you lots of useless information. Disassembly will give you a disassembly dump of the contents. Assembly is quite handy because it gives you an assembler source file that you can then play with and then reuse later. And the statistics tell you various useful things about how compatible the software is or the module is. If I run that, it goes and does its stuff, and I can then save that out to disk. Load it does that. I'm hoping that's the disassembly. Oh, here we go. That, for anyone who's familiar with it, is actually, going down here, is actually suitable for dropping into Acorn's Object.asm assembler. So I could actually rebuild that module from that disassembly that I've got there. And that's basically what I did after I'd taken all the non-32 bits out of it and made it work on the Ionics. I then rebuilt it and happily used it. And I think I admitted to this on the Ionics mailing list at some point, and a few people said, well, can't you send us a copy? I could do, but it's not actually very legal because I haven't got a license for it and it's not mine. So I eventually tracked Thomas down and said, I've done this 32-bit version of your module. It's very useful. Would you mind if I distribute it? And Thomas, as a lot of, I don't think people are finding, particularly Riscos Open, was saying at the Southwest show, they're finding a lot of people say when they get an approach like this. Thomas said, yeah, no problem at all. I'll make it public domain. Do with it what you want. So I kind of then inherited it. And over the next 2 or 3 years, I tidied the source up because obviously Thomas said I haven't got any source code for it. He said I've lost it somewhere along the way. So you're basically on your own. You've got what you've got, and that's it. So I then tidied it all up. And I got to the point when I started looking into this that I've got this source code ready to drop into Acorn's assembler, which I only ever fired up to generate like a clipboard, which was always a bit of a learning curve. So I had to scratch my head and remember how it worked every time I used it. And by this point, I was happily building all my other software, all my C stuff on a Linux machine using GCC software development kit, the cross-compiler tools and so on, because they were very useful for a whole range of reasons that I'll probably come on to in the course of this evening. So I went and did a bit of research to try and find out what I could do with Icon Clipboard and this source file, and found that GCC comes with an assembler, which comes with no documentation apart from a little note saying go and read the .jsm assembler documents because we do exactly what they do. So I thought, well, I might as well use that, because then anyone who picks up my source code can use it in Acorn's tools, they can use it in the free GCC tools that we want to. It's fairly sort of tool independent really, so you don't want to spend the money with rules, you can yourself unfortunate. So that seemed like quite a good way forward. And obviously, Icon Clipboard didn't take very long to update because I'd already done most of the work on that. And what I ended up with, if I can remember which of the folders I'm supposed to be looking into this, it's probably not that one. Yes, it is that one. Apologies. What I ended up with was this download here, which is what you can go and get to my website now. With all my software, it comes in 2 parts. So there's a source archive, and an archive for people who don't care about how it works, how it's made to work, but just want to use it. And Icon Clipboard comes as a little application which you can drop into your boot sequence or run when you want it, but as it's a desktop sort of edition, it's quite useful to stick it in boot. I'm now going to have to remember how I've installed it on this machine. I just got it added into boot, run and start up, so it gets run when the machine starts up. And you don't know it's there because it just sits there quietly doing nothing, but we know it's there because it responds to help if I ask it for information. So what does it actually do? Well, so at its simplest, it allows me to cut and paste text between bits of the desktop, as I said, and any applications it can understand. The clipboard. So we'll put some text into Zap, select it, and choose. Now this is Zap, so unfortunately it doesn't use the global clipboard in the same way everybody else does. It's actually Keep that I want to use to copy to the clipboard. Don't ask why. And then if I find myself at the right little icon somewhere, I can do Control V on the keyboard and it's pasted it in. And that obviously works both ways. I can cut from multiple icons and I can paste elsewhere as well. And that's basically what it does at its simplest. But Thomas obviously wanted a few other things when he wrote it originally, so he added other functionality into it. As standard nowadays, I ship it with all that turned off. But if I just open, well, I'll copy that out of the archive. Just close that. I'll just copy that out to my delete those. So open that up with the shift double click and load the configure file into Zap. there's various bits and pieces that we can turn on and off. So slightly kind of low level, but it is documented in the comments. So I've got a range of keys there that I can turn on, or keyboard shortcuts that I can turn on and off, which are Control T, Control S, Z, X, and so on through to C there. So if I just set that bit to 1, which you might be able to see corresponds to the S bit there, save that, and then rerun, or just run that configure file, that should turn Control S on, and suddenly I've gained the ability to press Control S on the writable icon and change the case of any letter, which is very much like what you get in a word processor. Another thing I can turn on, if I turn on the T key there, I'll just save that. Whoops, hang on, this is sad, remember that. I'll save. And delete that. If I press Control T, it'll insert today's date. And that's quite configurable too, because if I didn't fancy that date format, as long as I've read my welcome guide, RISC-OS welcome guide, where it tells you how to set alarm up, I can set up any date string I want there. I'll save that again, reconfigure that, and I'm finding a permanent writable icon really. And Control T now puts in a slightly more complete date. So it'll let you do little simple things like that. There's a few other features it's got, which I need to find a suitable text file to demonstrate. I'll load this text file up. You can see that's got a Windows style file name with a slash and then txt at the end. So if I go to save that, obviously Zap has carried that across the save dialog box. Icon Clipboard gives us a Control D combination, which de-dossifies the file name. I think that's where it comes from. So Control D removes the slash txt at the end of the file name. There's also a Control E, which just removes everything but the extension. I think that's all it does. I could be wrong on that one. Let's see what else it will let me configure. It does give me two more. Well, it gives you one more sort of cut and paste key. You've obviously got Control X, Control C, and Control V, which is standard cut, copy, and paste. And it also offers you Control Z, which, unlike the rest of RISC-OS, slightly confusingly, where that just clears the selection. Control Z, if I just copy that from here, Control Z will actually empty the icon and paste the clipboard in. So if I do Control Z, it's a one-shot operation, which is a little bit quicker and can be a time saver. So that was Icon Clipboard, and it does seem to be the application or the utility on my website that gains me the most sort of emails coming in from people, bug reports and so on. Still, recently, generally, other people's software that Icon Clipboard is getting blamed for, but it seems to gain a surprising amount of interest for something that nobody else seems to have heard of, which is quite nice. Icon Clipboard itself actually came with a little sister utility called Clipboard when it was originally published, and a while ago I split the two of them up simply because it made updating them a lot easier. And Clipboard itself is at version 0.15 at the moment, and it just comes as a little application. So if I install that on the hard disk there. The clipboard installs itself on the icon bar, and it just gives us a window that gives us access to the clipboard. So, I can't remember what the last thing I was, I typed my on the clipboard, but if I save that, it will save the contents of the clipboard out to a file or to another application. Similarly, if I do a paste into Zap, obviously that still pastes that in. If I drop a file onto clipboard and then paste it into Zap, it's just pasted that file in because that file's been copied onto the clipboard and then made available to other applications. So clipboard doesn't do very much, but it is quite a neat way to actually get access to it and drop and paste files onto the clipboard if you want to do so. So they're both freely available to download from my website. So that kind of got me, or getting Icon Clipboard back up and running, sort of got me going on the starting to rescue some of the stuff that I hadn't touched for a few years. And I then turned my attention to all the other little modules that I've written that I've got on my site. There's a surprising number of them, which are slightly more better organised if you actually go and look on my website. The problem with all of these is that they were at the time, they're all written in this basic assembler that had all these extensions in it, which doesn't work very well if you've got a modern version of BASIC. I just need to find a suitably older version. Here we go. So another module that I've got, which seems to be quite popular, is a tool called PC Keys, which I'll come on to look at next. And here was the source code for it. It's written in BASIC as an assembly file. If I try and run it, it says it's not going to sound debugged. It's looking hopeful. Yes. Oh. And that's because it's using these extensions that are supplied by a module that no longer works on RISC OS 5. So, after a lot of sort of thinking about what I could do and what would be easiest and what would involve doing expending any effort, I decided that about the only sensible thing I could do was transfer all of these into OBJSM format. That's the Acorn assembler, which will also work with the assembler tools on Linux, where I do my software development. And so I started doing that, thinking this would be a really massive job, and it actually turned out not to be too difficult. I think I was getting to the point, once I got into a pattern, I could probably do 2 or 3 modules in an afternoon, because it's all fairly mechanical cut and paste. And so I managed to get everything updated and buildable again, and then went through and fixed it all for modern hardware. And the first thing I re-released and also reissued and updated was PC Keyboard, which again was written as a result of getting an Ionix, getting RISC OS 5, and finding that Castle had moved all the keys around when it came to delete, copy, end. Because Acorn, in their wisdom, of course, decided to go down different to everybody else, so that whereas the rest of the world, Windows in particular, backspace deletes backwards and delete deletes forwards, Acorn decided backspace and delete might as well both do the same, because why not waste a key? And the key marked end actually deletes forward as delete would do on any other system. So when RISC OS 5 came out, Castle finally fixed it so that things worked properly. But then applications all behaved differently and there was no consistency. So I came up with PC Keyboards to actually patch individual applications that operated differently from the rest of the desktop. I then got various sort of hate emails from the people who like the Acorn version as a result of this, and added in various other features so that you can actually convert RISC OS 5 to work in the old Acorn style as well, using PC keys. So it's a fairly nice kind of multi-purpose thing now. I don't particularly endorse this alternative use for it, but it kept people happy and stopped them sending me emails, so that was good. So again, I've got well, I've almost certainly got PC keys installed on this machine. Oh, maybe I don't. Let's just see. Looks like I haven't. Oh well. I have a nasty feeling I've probably got too late a version of Edit on here for this to be a problem. Yeah, I have the fixed version of Edit as well, so that's not going to help, is it? When I did this demonstration last time, Edit was still, I think Edit was still broken. Let's see if we can find something else on this machine that doesn't behave.
Using some sort of sidebar utility stick, which one is it?
It's a little one that I've written again called, simply called Launcher, because I couldn't think of any better to call it. It's never been released because it's never been finished.
Oh, right, okay. Just wondered.
But it's sort of sitting there. One day I will get around to releasing it, but it needs tidying up and debugging and making usable first.
It was just saying about blinds. Is that still available now?
I believe so. I think it was that Quantum Soft.
I think it was.
I just remember pulling things down
Yes.
from the top of the
If
screen.
it's Quantum Soft, yeah, they 32-bit and everything, didn't they? Or
I think they did.
for them,
Vince Hunt's got it all on his website now. It's all on, it's on a subdomain of viscosity,
yeah.
I think. I'm sure I'll stick a link in the newsletter. But yes, it's good. It's all, Vince took all the software off Stuart, I think, a couple of years back, and it's all available to download. So this could be a rather tricky demo because I don't actually have any software on here. I don't think that will not work.
It's a funny thing to
You
say.
told us, Steve.
No, I have Zap. That's useful. Zap can be reconfigured, of course, so you wouldn't normally want to use Zap in this way. But that's the backspace key, and that's the delete key. So they're both behaving the same. So let's start by looking for that folder that I probably just closed down again. Utilities, PC keys. Here we go. So that comes again as a little application directory that you can install in your boot sequence somewhere. And just as with Icon Clipboard, it comes with a small configure file inside it. As supplied, I've supplied it to work to make applications and everything operate in the ViscoOS 5 style because that seems like the most logical thing, certainly with modern systems. And according to that, Fireworks 32 needs help as well, so let's just try that. I've got a copy of that on here. If people haven't spotted that, certainly Fireworks and Pipe Dream are now freely available and suitably happy on modern hardware as well. So let's create a letter. Yes, that is. So Fireworks has issues. That's my delete key. So that's the backspace key and that's delete. So they're both deleting the wrong way. So if I just start PC keys up by just running it the normal way, I'll put two more characters in there. That's backspace. Oops. Yes, I seem to recall hitting this problem last summer as well. This is good when you prepare things up front. Yes, they've changed the name of Fireworks, which caught me out last time I demoed this, I think. The one thing PC Keys needs to know before it can do its stuff is what applications you need to fix, because it obviously can't fix everything, because some applications already work fine on ViscoOS 5. So down at the bottom we've got a list of applications it needs to go and prod and change the keys around for. And when this was set up, Fireworks on 32-bit systems was called Fireworks 32. They've since come along, as you can see from here, and changed it just to Fireworks, so PC Keys can't find it. If I delete 32 and save that and rerun that configuration, myself a new letter. That's our backspace, and that's now delete, so it's now deleting the correct way around. So it's correctly picked that up. And obviously if you're running PC keys on your machine, any applications that you come across that you can't configure internally to change the keys around, you can just add them to that list at the bottom there, put the new add that command at the bottom and stick the name of the application after it. It does matter, they have to be exactly as they appear in the task manager, otherwise it won't pick them up. And so if you really have a desperate urgent on your Raspberry Pi or whatever to use the old Acorn style keys, you can always comment these 2 lines of the configuration file out, uncomment those 3, restart PC keys, and suddenly all your writable icons and all your applications that you need to configure will suddenly start behaving in the old Acorn style. Personally, that would probably drive me mad in about 5 minutes, seeing as I use other platforms quite a lot, but it obviously keeps some people happy. So that was PC Keyboard, which I got around to re-releasing. One of the other things I started doing as I was updating my software and reissuing it, everything I'd originally released had been released under a very odd freeware license that I sort of made up in the late 90s, when I didn't really know any better. And I had a bit of a problem when the Raspberry Pi came out, because Riscos Open were obviously putting together a software package to come out with new machines, and the person doing that clearly didn't fully understand the legal implications and was just gathering software that was available on the internet, putting it in the disk image, which I found out when I discovered that some of my applications, in fact print PDF was fairly core to the Raspberry Pi distribution at that point. It was how the printing was set up. And there was a rather entertaining little thread in the Rule forums where Fryatt and Stronghead Fame and myself, both within about half a day of each other, said, sorry, what? That's in the disk image? Because Fred didn't realise Stronghead was in it, and I'd not realised that print PDF was in it. I think we both fairly amicably sorted it out with Riscos Open once the people who did understand the legal stuff got involved, or we both gave them a license to distribute. And then I started looking at alternative licenses for all my software, because it had been something that was back in my mind for a while, to actually make stuff open source, properly open source. And after a lot of discussions and thought and talking to various people, after a tip-off actually from somebody on the Raw forums, I actually settled on something called the EUPL, which is actually the European Union Public License. The reason for going for down that route is it's basically a GPL style license, but without the really odd bits of the GPL. And the EU obviously came up with it because they wanted to release software internally and allow other members and anybody else as well. It's a true open source license which is recognised by the Open Source Initiative. But the rather interesting feature of it is that, as far as I'm concerned, I don't have to deal with all making the source code available for 3 years or whatever it is after I stop distributing stuff. But anyone can take it, include it in a GPL project, and as long as they take on responsibility, that's fine. So you can turn it into GPL if you want to, but I don't have to worry about it, so I was quite happy with that. And as I was releasing stuff, I began to actually update licenses, and that was actually almost a bigger job than updating the software itself, because you have to go through every single source file, every single documentation, and change the license references to make sure it's all copyrighted correctly and everything else. But the upside, as far as I was concerned, was that what I didn't want to happen to my software is what's happened to so many other people's, is that, you know, as long as people have grabbed the archives, they can do with them what they want now, because the source code is really out there. So hopefully it won't become, well, it should never become abandonware at any point in the future, because somebody else can always grab it and redistribute it if they need to. So that was PC Keyboard that I rescued, and then I had a little look around what else I had on my website. Find icon bar was totally irrelevant to anyone using anything other than Riscos 3, because it just pops the icon bar to the front of the Windows stack, which is available on all modern systems. Surprisingly, I have been asked to 32-bit it, so I have done that. And I think I was also asked to make it work on a modern BeagleBoard. I did that as well. I don't understand why, but you know, there you go. Perhaps slightly more usefully, was a little app called WinScroll. Well, not an app, a module called WinScroll, which, if I run it, doesn't do very much. But if I hover over a window with a scroll bar, hold down Control and click Menu, it gives me a very Windows-like sort of zoom focus point in the middle. If I found a window with something in it, so you actually see that. So I can just move the mouse away from the focus point. And if anyone's familiar with Word or Firefox or web browsers on Windows or Linux, you'll probably have come across that as well already. And that works in any window on the desktop that has scroll bars. Another utility which, again, is probably relevant to modern desktop as well was File and Directory Patch, which, if I go to a spare filer window and choose New Directory, it will create a directory, which it doesn't do by default, strange enough. It does if you're using RISC OS 4, I think, or RISC OS 6, but it doesn't do it on any other version of the operating system. And that's all that does. That's now available as well. And that pretty much exhausted all the little stuff I'd written in Schedule Basic Assembler. So I was half the way through the process, and then I hit the next problem, which is what to do all the basic stuff. Just checking I've not missed anything at that point. No, I don't seem to have done. Because by this point I was obviously building all my C stuff on Linux, so I was now building all the assembly stuff on Linux. I had a load of other build tools tied around it for generating documentation, strong help files, all that kind of stuff, automatically packaging stuff up and releasing it in archives. And suddenly I'd have to go back to basic, to RISC OS and do all this stuff manually, or develop a similar system if I was going to develop software written in BASIC on alongside everything else. The other small problem which came to light, which may or may not be a big deal to many developers, RISC OS developers, was that because BASIC's tokenized, if you look at if you load a BASIC program up, such as that one, when BASIC loads that up, or you enter it into BASIC, it actually turns all the keywords like print, on error, report, and so on, into what it calls tokens, which are very short, 1 or 2 byte representations of those. It's to save space and make it quicker to execute. The problem is that the file's then not plain text, and so revision control systems, source control systems that allow you to track changes to software, don't work with BASIC because they don't know how to do differences between 2 BASIC files. And that was a bit unfortunate, because by this point I was using Subversion quite extensively to track all my other RISC OS software, and I really wanted to get all the basic stuff into it. Partly because I backed it up quite well after my original accident with my hard drive. And it was quite easy. It was a lot easier to put stuff into a Subversion repository and back that up and know it was all safe. And obviously there's benefits to working with revision control. Once you've started, it's very difficult not to for projects. So I had a bit of a think about this, and then I thought a bit more, and then I asked questions on the Linux groups and didn't really get any helpful answers. But what I wanted to do, ideally, was to keep all the basic files as plain text and turn them into BASIC somehow, ideally on Linux, because that's where I was doing my development. I kind of gave up on that because it obviously wasn't going anywhere. And then I found myself looking at the RISC OS sources for printers, which Acorn developed, obviously, which appeared to be doing something very similar. So, and a bit of a poke around the source code and found that yes, they are, but obviously you build RISC OS on RISC OS, so you've got the basic module there. So I went back to CSA program and said, is anyone aware of a tool that would do this on other platforms? And a few people came back and said, no, but it'd be a really good idea if you wanted to write one. Yes, they do. So I thought, how hard can it be? Which is sort of famous final thought before regretting it. And I then went off and spent about three or 4 months writing a little bit of software called Tokenize, which some of you may have seen announcements for in news groups and that, which is basically what it says on the tin. It's a tokenizer for BASIC 5 that runs on both RISC-OS and any other platform that you want to compile it for, so it's written in C. And the idea was that I could then keep my basic source as text, keep it in revision control, tokenize it on the fly and release it, which seemed like quite a nice idea. It may also be relevant to programmers in RISC-OS, natively writing software in RISC-OS, because it's actually got a few neat little features which can help debug your basic code as well, and I'll quickly look at those as a short diversion before showing what I've done with it. So, if I go and look for a program that's written in BASIC, let's go for this all. I don't know if anyone's come across this little piece of software called GetFiler, which I wrote many years ago, around about the time that the Save Desktop option disappeared from the start menu, not start menu, from the switcher menu on the desktop. The Save Desktop hadn't had many problems, but it had one very useful feature, was that you could save all your file windows, and then cut that bit out of the event file and rerun it as a file on pinboard or whatever, and suddenly all these file windows would open up exactly where you'd left them. And I think it was RISC-OS Limited in its first on Select, and they'd taken the interface off but left all the code in the operating system. So I quite quickly wrote GetFiler, which seems I've got a load of file windows up there now. If you just click on it, it opens up a save dialog. I can save that to a file window, and if I just load that, like you can see, it's created a whole load of file open commands which will open those folders in the places specified. If I then close everything down apart from that one that's got that in the eBay file, if I run that, everything reappears where I left it. It's stupidly simple, that, because all the code to do it is still in the filer. It's just that they took away the menu item on the icon bar, mainly because you could get your machine into a serious mess if you actually used it without knowing what you were doing, because it saved a whole load of other stuff in the file as well that actually broke things, which is why it got removed. So that was GetFiler.
Stupid question, Steve. What happens if one of those folders no longer exists? Does it fall over, or does it just ignore it?
I think it will ignore it. If it doesn't, you can very easily edit it, if I remember rightly. We can try that. Let's create, rather than deleting something that's actually got stuff in it that I care about. If I create myself a directory, open that, and we'll just save that out like that. So if I run that again, that empty folder opens. If I delete it, it doesn't like that. However, I think it's that last one there. If I put an X in front of it, he says, no. Thought that would work, but apparently not. I may need to get back on that one. I think there is a way to do that, but I'm just going to blame Acorn and RISC-OS Limited after, or RISC-OS Open after, because after all it's their code. GetFiler is shamelessly borrowing. There's an X-pin command for pinning stuff to the pin board, but I'm not sure if there's an X. There is a command somewhere to do it. I'll have a look and maybe stick something in the newsletter next month if I remember and have a chance. But GetFiler, I think GetFiler is quite a simple little application, so hopefully it'll be fairly good to demonstrate the basic utilities that I've got or that I've produced. That's the source code that comes in the download, which I can safely set to be a text file. Load it into Zap, and you can see it's just a plain text file containing BASIC. that will actually load. It's completely compatible with BASIC as it stands. So if you're using RISC-OS, you can load that into BASIC straight away using the text load command, which anyone familiar with the BASIC command line or BASIC instructions may already be aware of. So just check I'm in the right place. Yeah, so I'm in that folder with that file in it. So we're going to BASIC and do text load, program renumbered. It does that because there's no numbers in the file. And there we are. So it's actually BASIC's loaded it quite happily. But I'm on RISC-OS, so it would do. You kind of expect that. If I wasn't on RISC-OS, I can use Tokenize, which does something very similar. I'm in the right place, I am still here. So it comes as a command line tool on RISC-OS. This is the RISC-OS build of it. And actually it's very simplest. I can just do and it's created a BASIC file there, which if I load it into Zap, you'll see, or we should see, is now a fully tokenized version of that file. So that's it being used at its very simplest, but it does give us a few other little options which I put in. So, as I was using Tokenize to actually tokenize some very old software that I didn't really remember how it worked. I put a couple of, and because I was actually processing the contents of the files as I went, I put a couple of little useful tools in to track and report back on variables and procedures, because as anyone who's written in BASIC will know, it's scarily easy to mistype a variable name or mistype a procedure name or a function name, and only find out when somebody actually uses that bit of the software and you get an email saying it don't work. So we can ask Tokenize if I run that again, but add the warn parameter and ask it to warn me of procedures and variable names. It's come back and told me a number of useful things. For example, I've assigned a variable A%, but I've never used it. Does that mean I typed it wrongly and then I'm trying to read from a different variable somewhere else by mistake? Or I've assigned result but never read it. There's a whole load of functions and procedures that haven't got definitions in there. And that's because I'm actually linking to a library which isn't included here, so they're all in the library. I've defined a function that never gets used. You know, is that a typo? Am I trying to call it somewhere but I've mistyped it? So that's quite handy, and I've certainly found that very handy when going through all the old applications, because it's effectively given me a level of debugging that I wouldn't have otherwise got. And I found some rather interesting things that I wasn't previously aware of. So that was certainly useful. So that, to an extent, makes Tokenize useful on RISC-OS as well. If anyone's wondering why on earth would we want to use BASIC, well, BASIC won't tell you that kind of thing. And obviously, if you're trying to work on other platforms, then it works on other platforms, and BBC BASIC doesn't. It was actually quite interesting getting it written and proving it worked, because I went and asked a fairly stupid question. I thought it might have been stupid when I asked it, but I thought I'd ask it anyway. Is there actually a spec for BASIC? How will I test it works? And I asked this on programming news group. And again, I got Bobby from back saying, that's an interesting question. Yeah, no idea really. So in the end, after a fair bit of discussion, what I actually do with Tokenize, I've collected every single BASIC program on my machine that I've got. I just set locate off and went and found every single basic file, worked out what all the unique ones were. I got basic itself to convert them into text using text save, and then re-tokenize them using text loader, as I've just done there. And I do the same thing myself with tokenize and compare the results. And that's actually turned up into some interesting bugs in BASIC as well, which have been fixed in RISC-OS 5. So if you have a latest version on your Raspberry Pi or whatever, BASIC's got a couple of less but fewer bugs than you've had before because tokenize found them. So I suppose that was useful perhaps, or perhaps not. So what did I do with tokenize, having actually spent so much of my time actually writing it? Well, I went through and resurrected all the other applications that were left on my website, brought them up to date, fixed them for modern machines, made them style guide compliant, and re-released them under a new license. And the first one, which was quite satisfying because there'd been a half-written version sat on the Ionics since my hard disk crashed back in 2004 or 5 or whenever it was Float, which is a little interactive help application, which is slightly less relevant nowadays because it was written before RISC-OS had a proper floating bubble delta type arrangement. It's still used, if anyone can remember, when you had a fixed window in the corner of the desktop. So Float, and I think it was the first application I ever actually released as well. It has a certain sort of heritage there. But if I run it, it installs itself down on the far left of that, on far right of the icon bar, as it should do because it's a help application. And if I turn it on and point to things that offer help, it tells me that's the pin board. It doesn't tell me that's the file. I'll explain why in a second. That's transient, apparently. I can only assume that SmartFS doesn't give help. Clearly it doesn't. Oh well, we should report that then. And in and of itself, that's basically all it will do is the same as the Acorn version will do. But it's really well configurable, as we can find if we go to choices. You can configure the time, the speed that things open and close, and how long they stay on the screen for. You can turn off help. So I can turn off help for window furniture. If I turn that on, it'll tell me that's a title bar, which can get a bit boring after a while. So, and it just click, opens up the configure window quite quickly. So I can turn that off. You can turn off icon by help if you don't want that, if it gets in the way. And there's a default message I think that says I don't have any help for this window, so you can turn that off as well. We can configure the font used and the colours and the size and so on. And the other thing it can do is set up tasks that you want to ignore because you know how they work. So if I remove the filer from that and apply it, it will start telling me how the filer works, which again you sort of get used to after a while. So you can go back to ignore tasks. You can either type a task name in down there, but as we saw before with PC keys, you have to get the names exactly right. So it'll offer you all the ones that are currently running. The file is there, I can put that in, add it to the list. I could also have it ignore, well, if I was just apply that for now, obviously the file is gone. It's still offering help for Zap and Display Manager. If I go to ignore tasks, I could add Zap in, and now it's offering me help for the Display Manager, but not for Zap. So it's fairly configurable in that way. That's basically all it does. It just sits in the corner and gets on with itself. Still has a loyal following, supposedly, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to get it updated. And so that's now fully compatible, as far as I know, with modern systems. Yeah, so obviously get file is another little utility that I got working once I got Tokenize up and running. And the other little applications I rescued at the same time were a whole bunch of little games that I'd created many years ago. Some of these were scarily non-style guide compliant, I suppose, if you like. They dated back to the earliest ones, I think, were some of the earliest programs I actually wrote for RISC-OS as opposed to actually releasing for. I think I released the better stuff first and then filled the website up with all the junk I could find on my hard drive, or something like that. And if I can find older version, it might be interesting to show the evolution. It's a case of remembering where they're buried, because this machine has got data going back to several years of ago, and shows that on its hard drive or its SD card. Let's try that. Yeah, they look suitably old. So I can run them from the archives actually. One of the earliest things was Crosses, which is a rather poor Noughts and Crosses game, and that's how it came originally. So it's not got a computer player running at the moment, or it hasn't got one. And O wins apparently. I can turn the computer player on if I want, and then the computer will do its best to win or not. But it's actually hideously non-Starcraft compliant if you start looking through the code, looking through it, and it doesn't internationalise, if anyone cares about that sort of thing. So that was candidate one if you look at updating. Solitaire is another game which does the not the American card game version of Solitaire. There was Master, which probably might be up with all sorts of copyright infringement, which again looks quite dated and doesn't barely even manages to do menus or anything. It's got an icon bar menu. So I sort of had a look through these, and armed with some of the comparison tools available, so on the Linux side, started comparing all the different files for these, looking at all the light shared libraries they were using and trying to rationalise everything, bring everything up to date, fix it, make it meet what I would call sort of modern programming standards. And the results were these, I hope, yes. Crosses was the first kind of victim. Computer player's on by default now, so and it shows the winning line as well. It's become a bit more style guide compliant. Windows look a bit more modern. It also has gained a 3D game, because I used to have on my, I think I still do have on my website, a single tasking out of the desktop 3D Noughts and Crosses, and thought, well, I might as well just get it all into one game. So slightly confusing because it's effectively a cube sat on top of each other. You've got that at the top up there, then you've got that one in the middle, and then that board's sort of at the bottom. So that square, and that square will be a row, for example. It can be a bit confusing. Because the computer's managed to win straight down to the board there. So that was one. Or the first victim of the updates. Master got updated, so it looked a little bit more, a little bit less kind of clunky. That wasn't a very good start because there's no matches at all. Oops. I've got 3 pegs in that. So that was another victim, and Solitaire got an update as well, and also benefited from the fact that I now have artworks which I didn't have before when I designed these. So all 3 of them became a lot more standard compliant in the process. Then after, obviously got relicensed as well at the same time. Another game which has always been on my website and which seems to have been the most, sort of has gained the most correspondence, it's a game called Pairs, which is sort of fairly traditional memory game where you've got a whole load of images on the backs of the cards, and you've got to turn over 2 cards in a turn and try and find pairs, and when a pair come up you take them away. So if I turn over those 2, the computer will then turn a couple over. They may be fairly familiar old style Risco's file icons, I'm afraid. there's a pair. And the computer's remembered that, which is unfortunate. The computer's doing quite well there. One of the things that actually worried me about this game, or worried me when I wrote this game, I decided to specify the forgetfulness and percentage terms for the computer rather than giving it hardness level. You specify how much of what it knows every turn the computer will forget. And you have to forget a scarily large amount of stuff. It's getting quite close to 100% of what it knows it forgets every turn before you can actually beat it or frighten it, which may or may not be a good thing. The pairs kind of evolved quite a bit because I got into a long chain of email correspondence with a guy whose name I can't remember now, who was a special needs teacher, I think across in Manchester, who found this on my website. You can set different sets of cards, so you can change the style of the images, you can change the size of them and that sort of thing, and you can configure how long they show up on screen for. And he came back and said, it's really good, but it would really help in this. He said, I'm already using it with my with the children I teach. Would it be possible to make sounds when you turn the cards over? Because he said that would be really ideal for sort of helping them make connections between the sounds and the pictures and that sort of thing. Probably. I'll have a look into it, so I had to think about it and implemented that, sent it back to him, and he came back very happy and said, yes, brilliant, that's exactly what I want. And we had a bit more to and fro and did a few more updates and so on as we went along. I don't know, I'm assuming he probably isn't still using it because I'm imagining his school is probably not using Risk OS anymore, but I know he was certainly using it for a few years quite successfully, which was surprising because it was never intended as an educational tool. It was just written maybe for the fun of seeing if it could make it work. So that was pairs, and finally the other one that fell out of a sort of Acorn user article, I think, or Stein article many years ago, was Hangman, which simply borrows an impression spelling dictionary to allow you to guess at words that it picks at random from the impression dictionary that's for over a given length. I'm probably going to have to do a bit of feed on that one. I'll try this. Oh, yeah.
Nice. Renationalised.
I've had that already.
Oh, right.
Actually rationalised. There we go. Got there eventually.
Let's go.
So that was just written as a bit of a fun experiment with the impression dictionary, and it will fairly quickly go. And you can tell it how long the words need to be that it will pick up, and how many guesses you want to set, and so on. And that pretty much is that as far as all that collection of software goes. Everything I've shown tonight, I think pretty much everything, with the exception of a couple of applications that are on my site that aren't worth updating really, everything now does work on modern hardware. It's all been zero-pained as well, as best I can, so it should be fully compatible with new versions of Risk OS. And as far as I'm aware, it's all happily running on a BeagleBoard this evening. And I'd imagine it will be running on Raspberry Pi 3 as well, although no one's told me it doesn't yet. That's probably because there's no one out there with copies.
You can be quite confident that they will if it is the case.
I think I can, because I don't use the two instructions that have disappeared from the ARM v8 architecture, so I'm pretty confident that I won't be affected. The differences from a Raspberry Pi 2 are very small. Unfortunately, where the reason that so much is broken is that the operating system and Unix have both used the instructions with very low level, scary low level stuff, and so everything that uses Unix is broken. But it's not a big change. It's just unfortunate that everything used one library. So that's basically that. And with all those changes and so on, it basically means that I'm now able to develop my software in a fairly modern way, I think, and control all the source code and track the changes, which makes life a lot easier and makes it much easier to respond to bugs and so on, because it's easier to keep track of what I've changed and also release small updates while working on other things, which is always a problem when someone sends you a bug report and you think, well, I'd love to release an update, but I've just broken this bit. Whereas if you've got some control over the source, you can always release the update anyway and just take the broken bits out. Certainly I found it useful and it's helped, but then again, it has occupied most of the last 3 or 4 years of my risk-course development time, so whether it's actually been overall useful is another matter. But it's been interesting.
Will actually help Basic as a result?
It may have done. I mean, we've certainly tracked down a few. So the interesting thing about developing it was the number of anomalies that came up that turned out to be bugs in Basic.
Yeah.
Because obviously once, as I said, I think I found about 3,500 unique Basic files on my computers after, which was the test set I used. I think I had about 10,000 Basic files, but of those there were 3,500 different ones. Obviously anything that had been crunched by one of these scary crunchers that people use was pretty much written off. Nothing can retokenize that, so they got written off immediately. Then there was a whole load of really weird stuff out there. Because Basic seems to be surprisingly tolerant to garbage input, which is quite interesting. So the number of things that have jumbled line numbers was quite scary, because normally you assume line numbers start at 1 or 10 and count upwards, but apparently they don't have to. Apparently they can count down, or they can just be random numbers, or whatever you like really, and Basic will quite happily take that. Obviously Tokenize doesn't like it because it expects numbers to be sequential. Neither does, as you saw, TextLoad doesn't like it either because it expects them to be sequential. So those couldn't be retokenized, which was quite interesting. So once I drew all those out, and I drew all out the crunch stuff, there's obviously one Basic cruncher out there that does some very, very odd things in terms of not crunching as such, but I can't tell you what it did. I think it's strong compress or something like that. It came up again recently because I think it was Dr. Wimp was sort of promoting it, and it does some very odd things to the Basic. So those I discarded. But then we're getting down to actually things that Basic gets wrong, but then tolerates for some reason. So the interpreter's obviously very, very flexible as well, which is interesting. Presumably it slows it down a bit, I don't know. But yes, certainly I uncovered one bug in RISC-OS 5's Basic, which got fixed, which they'd introduced while fixing a bug in RISC-OS 4 Basic. And then I think the documentation, there's a list, the documentation for the tokenized lists a few other known features where tokenized and Basic differ in what they do. And I've assumed that I'm right, because I think I actually am technically. It's just the tokenizer gets it wrong. The other quite surprising thing, which was raised a few slightly heated emails from the anti-RISC-OS Open Limited camp, is you've got to decide what Basic you're approaching now, because Basic 4 and 5, sorry, not Basic 4, no, RISC-OS 5 Basic 5 and RISC-OS 4 and 6 Basic 5 are actually very different beasts now. And if you feed the same, because I did all my testing on RISC-OS 5, right, actually probably on this BeagleBoard because it was quite a convenient one to be doing the work on. And then I had some thought, I probably ought to check all this on RISC-OS 4 just to see, or how would it work if I tried it, because I've obviously got an emulator running with RISC-OS 4 on it. So I did, and I got a whole completely different set of errors and discrepancies. So I had to go through all them. And you have to go back through the documentation and try and work out, is this right? Is something I'm doing wrong? Is Basic doing it differently? Which one's right? And it turns out they're both right to their documentation. It's just that they're both different. Because RISC-OS Limited changed their version and upgraded their version. RISC-OS or PACE and then RISC-OS Open did different changes to theirs. They're not entirely compatible. So you have to pick one and just go with it, basically. I have documented, I think, all the ones I'm aware of in the help file. The biggest gotcha appears to be the quit keyword, which used to be just a means of quitting Basic command line interpreter, has actually become a function in Basic in RISC-OS 5, which means that if you have a variable called quitting, all in capital letters, it'll break. And it's apparently documented. It's actually quite a useful. What they've done is quite a useful change, if I remember rightly. But I was very surprised when I found it because it will break. If anyone's used a variable called quitting, it will break. So yeah, it was quite educational actually. That and so it has fixed one bug, and it's taught me a lot about how scary BASIC is. The other thing is that the source code for BASIC is extreme, because in the end it turned out the only documentation really is going to read the source code. And the source code is written without any kind of encumbrance from comments or meaningful labels or anything like that. And it's very, very cleverly written as well. And if you can take a shortcut, or you can cut a couple of instructions out by doing something clever. Sophie Waltham's done that. And I think the hardest job of tokenize actually was just sitting down and taking the source code and going, oh, that's what it does. But there was talk, I don't know whether anything's come up with it, if anyone is interested in pursuing the cross-platform tokenize, it's actually in the GCC auto builder nowadays. I got an email off Theo Marquetas, who maintains that, saying, would you like to put it in the auto builder? And we might as well. So I've done that. There was a vague talk about it possibly using it to replace BBC Basic in the tokenizing for the RISC-OS build system, if people wanted to try and build it on GCC on other platforms, because there is interest from RISC-OS Open about trying to reduce the dependency on RISC-OS for the building, mainly because I don't know if anyone's aware of how that works at the moment. Obviously RISC-OS Open have got a build system that runs every night and builds a new version of the operating system. I was talking to Rob Sprowson down at the Southwest show, and it sounds quite complicated because the entire thing is done inside an emulator, a virtual RPCMU emulator running RISC-OS 5, because the build system can only run on RISC-OS, but because they're running it on a server, it's got to run in an emulator. And the whole thing runs very scary jobs where it times things and throws files across the emulator at different times of the night. And it takes about half a day, I think, to do the full build, because everything does a little bit and then throws a file somewhere else, and a couple of hours later something else picks it up and does something more to it. So there's a certain amount of interest in getting rid of all that and saying we can build it on RISC-OS still for people who want to do that. But our nightly build server does it on Linux, because then it's suddenly simplified a lot. But I've never heard anything more about that, so I'm guessing that they've got more important things to worry about. Yeah, I think that's about all I've got to say really, unless anyone's got any questions.
When do you sleep?
You just have to know.
Yeah. I've actually done surprisingly little development in the past few years, a couple of years, because I have been doing so many other different things, and software development has taken a back seat, unfortunately, which is one of the reasons. Southwest Show was the first time I actually brought new software to a show for about 2 or 3 years, I think. And to be fair, some of the stuff that's been going on has been doing the sort of background work, hasn't really resulted in anything visibly new. I just don't have a lot of time either anymore, so it's also suffering. It takes a lot longer to do things than I'd like, but that's...
So, do all the Dr. Wimp and things like that still work on all the RISC-OS 5 versions nowadays?
As far as I know, I think Dr. Wimp does, because it's entirely in BASIC and there's no interactions or anything. What's the other one? At BASIC, I think, may have. I think it works, but I think it's got some issues, and some of the supplied tools aren't necessarily 32-bit compliant, or aren't necessarily ARM v7 compliant. Sorry, they're two different things there. I think Gavin Wraith was also talking to the developer of that a while back to try and work out whether he could free the source up or anything for that, because it's saying sort of closed source in a way, or some bits of it are. The other ones, who knows? Wimp Basic probably doesn't, because who knows where that went.
Yes.
And there's also there's a C equivalent. It's a Dr. Wimp C, I think. I don't know what the status of that is, but there are surprisingly few easy routes into programming at the moment, unfortunately. One of the most frequently asked questions that I see on the wall forums is, how do I write software? or I can write software for other platforms. How do I write it for RISC-OS? Seems to be the first commonly asked question. But again, just give me time to document it, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks very much, Steve. See as many of you as possible on 16th.
Just out of the background, what's the relation to RISC-OS 5?
Using RISC-OS 5 on one of the sort of RV7 platforms, and you can find time to run one of the zero-page relocated versions with zero pain and report back the bugs you find to the developers. We do appreciate it, because sometimes we don't spot them ourselves. And quite a lot of them are fairly easy to fix, and quite a lot of the bugs that are coming up are quite serious, so it's really just nice to know about them and get them fixed.
Rock, helping you with Acorn and RISC-OS computing.